I never planned to work night shifts at Memorial Hospital, but when you're a nursing student with mounting debt and instant ramen as your main food group, you take whatever hours you can get. My name's Alex, and 3 years ago I was drowning. Student loans piling up, rent constantly late, and my car making that concerning rattle that screamed, expensive repair. Nursing school was my dream, but dreams don't pay bills. Memorial Hospital sits on the edge of downtown, this massive concrete structure that looks almost haunted when the sun goes down. But it was my lifeline. Night shift paid an extra $4 an hour. Doesn't sound like much, but when you're counting pennies, it's everything. So there I was, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 3 nights a week, walking those eerily quiet hallways, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the occasional beeping of monitors, the only soundtrack. Night shifts have this strange quality. Time moves differently. The world outside sleeps while you exist in this bubble where minutes can drag like hours during the quiet periods. Then suddenly you're racing against the clock when something goes wrong. Most nights I'd down coffee after coffee just to keep my eyes open, checking vitals, changing IVs, and listening to the life stories of patients who couldn't sleep. The elderly man in 214 who fought in Vietnam. The young mom in 220 worrying about her kids at home. Human connections in the middle of the night feel different, more raw, more honest. My supervisor, Nurse Garcia, was a tough woman with 20 years of experience and zero tolerance for mistakes. This job isn't about you being tired, she'd remind me. It's about them not dying. Harsh, but true. I learned more following her around for one shift than I did in a week of classes. She noticed how I struggled to stay awake some nights and started assigning me to the more active floors, a kindness disguised as a challenge. Every morning as I dragged myself to my car, I'd wonder how long I could keep this up. Studying during breaks, catching naps between classes and shifts, barely seeing my roommates or having anything resembling a social life. My grades were good, but not great. My clinical performance was competent, but not outstanding. I was surviving, not thriving, and the finish line of graduation seemed to be moving further away with each exhausted step I took. If you've ever felt like you're working hard but going nowhere, this story might change your perspective. I certainly felt stuck in an endless cycle. Work to pay for school, be too tired from work to excel at school, repeat. But that all changed one Tuesday night when Nurse Garcia handed me an assignment that seemed routine, but would ultimately rewrite my entire future. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. Not just for me, but for one of the most powerful men in the city who, despite his wealth and influence, turned out to be the loneliest person I'd ever met. The night it all began started like any other. I clocked in at 10:45 p.m., grabbed a coffee from the break room that tasted like it had been sitting there since the morning shift, and headed to the nurse's station for handover. I remember it was raining, that constant drizzle that makes everything feel more isolating. My scrubs were still damp from the dash from the parking lot, and I was already counting down the hours until I could crawl into bed. Alex, you're on the 5th floor tonight, Nurse Garcia said, not looking up from her clipboard. I froze mid-sip. The 5th floor was the VIP wing. Private rooms with actual decent furniture, reserved for wealthy donors, politicians, and occasionally celebrities who wanted medical care without the publicity. None of us students ever got assigned there. There must be a mistake, I said. I'm not qualified for... Short-staffed, she cut me off. Room 302 needs regular vitals and medication at midnight and 4 a.m. Everything's in the chart. He's stable, just recovering from pneumonia. Think you can handle that without burning the place down? I nodded, trying to hide the mix of excitement and terror. The VIP floor was legendary among the staff. Significantly fewer patients, strict privacy protocols, and rumors of hefty tips left by grateful billionaires. Though I doubted anyone would be tipping a student who could barely take blood pressure without double-checking everything. The 5th floor was noticeably different. The harsh fluorescent lights gave way to softer, warmer lighting. The linoleum floors became carpeted hallways. Even the air smelled better. Less antiseptic, more like an upscale hotel. The nurse's station was staffed by a single nurse who barely acknowledged me as I approached. You the student? She asked, eyes on her computer screen. 302's chart is here. Don't engage in unnecessary conversation, don't ask personal questions, and don't mention who he is if you recognize him. He's requested minimal interaction. Great, a high-maintenance patient who didn't want to be bothered. I reviewed the chart. Male, 58, recovering from pneumonia complicated by exhaustion. Medications were straightforward. Vitals had been stable. The name was unfamiliar to me. Robert Kessler. As I approached room 302, I noticed two things. First, the door was one of those fancy wood ones instead of the standard issue. And second, despite it being visiting hours until midnight, there was no one coming or going. Most patients on other floors had family members lingering until the last possible minute. Not here. I knocked softly and waited, as was protocol. No answer. I knocked again, then slowly opened the door. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp in the glow of a laptop screen. And there he was, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, sitting up in bed, typing furiously on what looked like the most expensive computer I'd ever seen. He didn't look up as I entered. What struck me wasn't his appearance, but the emptiness of the room. No flowers, no cards, no personal items except for a sleek suitcase in the corner and his laptop. Even our poorest patients usually had something. A worn photo, a child's drawing, some token that connected them to the world outside. This man's room felt more like a temporary office than a place of healing. Little did I know that this sparse room and this seemingly detached man would become the center of a connection that would completely reshape my understanding of success, purpose, and what it means to truly live. "Excuse me," I said, my voice coming out higher than I intended. "I'm Alex, a student nurse. I need to check your vitals." Robert Kessler glanced up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, his eyes assessed me. That quick, evaluating look I'd later learn he gave everyone. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting, just gave a curt nod and returned to his typing. "I'll be quick," I promised, approaching his bedside and pulling the vitals card alongside me. My hands trembled slightly as I wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm. It was 2 a.m., and the hospital had that distinctive night shift quiet, the kind where every sound feels amplified. The soft beep of the machine seemed to echo through the room. "Your blood pressure is a bit elevated," I noted, looking at the numbers. "Are you feeling okay?" "I'm running a multinational company from a hospital bed at 2 in the morning. Elevated blood pressure seems appropriate," he replied without looking up. His voice was deeper than I expected, with an edge of exhaustion that no amount of power or money could mask. I continued through the routine: temperature, pulse, oxygen levels, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. The silence felt heavy, punctuated only by the click of his keyboard. I noticed dark circles under his eyes, the slight wheeze in his breathing that the pneumonia had left behind. "You should be sleeping," I said before I could stop myself, immediately regretting breaking the minimal interaction rule. He paused his typing and looked at me directly for the first time. His eyes were surprisingly alert for someone who should have been exhausted. "Sleep is inefficient," he said simply. "This merger won't finalize itself." I recorded his vitals in the chart, noticing that his previous readings had all been taken while he was working. "The doctor ordered rest as part of your treatment plan," I pointed out. "Recovery requires sleep." "Recovery requires competent medical care and antibiotics," he countered. "Sleep is optional." Something about his dismissive tone struck a nerve. Maybe it was my own exhaustion, or the stress of student loans that had just hit my inbox that morning, but I found myself responding without the careful filter I usually maintain with patients. "Actually, sir, sleep is when your body does most of its healing. Even the most expensive antibiotics can't work effectively if you're pushing yourself to exhaustion. But I'm sure you know better than decades of medical research." I froze, horrified at my sarcasm. This was exactly how students lost their clinical placements. I braced for him to demand another nurse or report me to administration. Instead, something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but close. He closed his laptop halfway and leaned back against his pillows. "What's your name again?" he asked. "Alex," I repeated, preparing for the complaint that would surely follow. "Alex?" he echoed. Tell me, are you always this direct with patients who could have you removed from the program with one phone call? My heart raced, but something told me honesty was my only option. Only with the ones who seem determined to end up back here with complications because they won't follow basic medical advice. He studied me for a moment longer, then did something that surprised me even more. He closed his laptop completely. Fine, he said. 10 minutes. I'll attempt this asleep concept you're so passionate about. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. What year are you in? Nursing school. Third year, I answered, pausing at the door. One more to go. He nodded thoughtfully. And you work nights while attending classes? 3 nights a week, I confirmed. Ambitious, he remarked, though I couldn't tell if it was approval or criticism. Necessary, I corrected. Tuition doesn't pay itself. For a fleeting moment, I saw something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. Then it was gone, replaced by the same guarded expression. Good night, Alex, he said, reaching for the light switch. Good night, Mr. Kessler, I replied, stepping out into the hallway. I didn't realize it then, but that simple exchange, those few minutes of honest conversation, had planted the seed for what would become the most unexpected relationship of my life. In a hospital full of patients, I'd somehow managed to connect with the one person who seemed determined not to connect with anyone at all. Over the next few nights, room 302 became a regular part of my rotation. Each time I entered, I expected Mr. Kessler, Robert, as he eventually insisted I call him, to be surrounded by visitors or colleagues. But the room remained stubbornly empty aside from his constant presence. No flowers appeared, no cards. His phone rarely rang, and when it did, the conversations were brisk, business-focused, and devoid of personal warmth. Initially, our interactions were brief. I'd check his vitals, adjust his IV, and leave with minimal conversation. But gradually, something shifted. It started with simple questions. Do you always work the night shift? He asked on my third night as I recorded his blood pressure. 3 nights a week, I replied. It pays better than days. He nodded thoughtfully. Sacrificing sleep for financial gain? Perhaps we're not so different after all. That comment opened a door between us. Each night, our conversations grew longer. Minutes stretched into half hours as I found myself perched on the edge of the visitor's chair that nobody else ever used. At first, we discussed safe topics, my nursing program, his improving health. But soon the conversations deepened. Why nursing? He asked one particularly quiet night around 3 a.m., when the hospital felt like it existed in a different dimension from the rest of the world. I told him about my grandmother, how she'd raised me after my parents died, how a skilled hospice nurse had made her final days peaceful, and how I'd promised myself I'd provide that same comfort to others. I hadn't meant to share so much, but there was something about the nighttime quiet and his attentive silence that invited honesty. You chose a career based on human connection, he observed. Interesting. What about you? I asked, breaking another rule about not questioning VIP patients. Why business? His eyes grew distant. Control, he said simply. When you build something, you determine its success or failure. No dependencies, no vulnerabilities. As his pneumonia improved, our talks expanded. I learned he'd built his company, a tech firm specializing in medical software, from nothing. He'd been working since he was 16, putting himself through college, climbing from entry-level programmer to CEO through relentless work and sacrifice. You remind me of myself at your age, he told me once. The determination, the willingness to push beyond reasonable limits. I take that both as a compliment and a warning, I replied, glancing meaningfully at his hospital bed. His pneumonia, the doctors had explained, had been exacerbated by extreme exhaustion and neglect of his own health. He actually laughed at that, a sound I suspected was rare in the boardrooms where he usually spent his time. Touché, nurse. During our 5th night, as I was checking his oxygen levels, he asked about my student loans. I hesitated, embarrassed to admit the crushing amount, but eventually shared the truth. 6 figures, I confessed. I'll be paying them off for decades. For work that saves lives but pays a fraction of what my executives make for moving decimal points, he mused. The market values the wrong things. That night, he shared more about himself, how his single-minded focus on success had cost him 2 marriages, how his adult children barely spoke to him, how the company that had been his life's work had slowly consumed everything else that might have mattered. "I built an empire," he said quietly, "but empires are cold places to live alone." I didn't know how to respond to such vulnerability from a man who projected such strength. So I simply sat with him in that moment, two people adrift in the middle of the night, connected by the strange intimacy that hospitals create between strangers. By the end of that week, I realized we had formed an unlikely friendship. Me, a struggling student surviving on coffee and determination. Him, a man who could buy the hospital if he wanted to, but couldn't seem to purchase what he actually needed. Connection, purpose beyond profit, someone who saw him as a person rather than a position. Our midnight conversations became the highlight of my shifts. In them, I found unexpected wisdom about perseverance. And in me, I think he found something equally valuable. A reminder of the human element his life had been missing, and a chance to see the world through eyes unclouded by wealth and power. What neither of us realized was how completely these simple nighttime talks would transform both our futures. It happened during my sixth night shift. I just finished with my other patients and was heading to room 302 for Robert's midnight check. As I approached his door, I heard a sound that made my heart drop. A harsh, racking cough followed by a struggle for breath. I rushed in without knocking to find him hunched over, face flushed, gasping between coughing fits. "I'm fine," he managed to say, though the blue tinge around his lips told a different story. His oxygen level had dropped dangerously low, and his fever had spiked to 103. The pneumonia was fighting back. "I need to call your doctor," I said, already reaching for the phone. "No," he rasped. "Just give me a minute." Even in crisis, his need for control remained. "This isn't a board meeting you can postpone," I said firmly, pressing the call button. "Your body is shutting down." What followed was a blur of activity. The on-call doctor rushing in, oxygen being increased, new antibiotics ordered, and tests to rule out complications. Through it all, Robert remained stoically silent, answering questions with minimal words, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if this betrayal by his body was simply another problem to be managed. My shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m., but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I stayed, hovering at the edges of his room, checking in between my handover duties. By morning, his condition had stabilized, but the doctor's words lingered in the air. "Mr. Kessler, you need to take this seriously. Your body can't sustain this level of stress." As the day shift took over, I should have gone home. Instead, I found myself returning to his room. He looked smaller somehow, the hospital gown and oxygen mask stripping away the armor of expensive suits and authority he usually wore. "You're still here," he noted, voice muffled by the mask. "Wanted to make sure you didn't try to schedule a board meeting while fighting for breath," I replied, attempting levity to mask my concern. He attempted a smile that looked more like a grimace. "First time anyone stayed past their shift for me." The raw honesty in his statement hit me harder than I expected. I pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down. "That can't be true. What about family, friends?" "My assistant would," he said after a moment, "but she's in Singapore closing a deal." He paused, then added quietly, "My son called when I was first admitted." We spoke for 3 minutes. I thought about my own life, my small apartment shared with two other nursing students, our chaotic but loving friendships, the weekly video calls with my aunt and cousins who always asked how I was doing before asking what I was doing. "Success comes with sacrifice," Robert continued, as if reading my thoughts. "I chose this path. Did you?" I asked, surprising myself with the directness. "Or did you just keep moving forward without looking around?" The question hung between us, heavier than either of us expected. For a long moment, he didn't respond, just stared out the window at the city skyline, a city where he owned buildings, but apparently had no one to call. "I was your age," he finally said, "working 3 jobs to pay for engineering school, living on vending machine food and 4 hours of sleep. I promised myself if I ever made it, I'd never be vulnerable again." His eyes met mine, unexpectedly exposed. Financial security became more important than everything else. "And now?" I asked softly. He gestured weakly around the empty hospital room. "And now I have a net worth with 8 figures and not a single person who would sit with me through the night." The moment felt pivotal, as if something fundamental had shifted between us, beyond patient and nurse, beyond the casual friendship we'd formed. In his moment of physical vulnerability, he'd revealed something far more personal. "You have me," I said simply. I stayed. His eyes, usually sharp with analysis, softened almost imperceptibly. For a split second, I saw past the CEO to the person, a man confronting the cost of choices made decades ago. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying weight beyond its size. I considered my answer carefully. Because everyone deserves someone who notices when they can't breathe. It wasn't until I was finally driving home, exhausted beyond measure, that I realized something had fundamentally changed. Our conversations had been meaningful before, but there had always been a professional boundary, a clear delineation between his world and mine. That invisible line had blurred during those early morning hours, revealing a connection neither of us had anticipated, but both, perhaps, desperately needed. Robert's health improved steadily after that night, but something else had changed too. Our conversations deepened, exploring topics beyond the superficial. I shared more about my struggles balancing school and work, the anxiety of mounting debt, and my fears of burning out before even starting my career. He listened with an intensity I'd come to recognize as his way of showing he valued what was being said. One night, about a week after his setback, I arrived for my shift to find him sitting fully dressed in a chair by the window rather than in his hospital bed. The oxygen tube was gone, and color had returned to his face. "They're discharging me tomorrow," he announced as I entered. "That's great news," I said, feeling both happy for his recovery and strangely disappointed that our nightly talks would end. "Back to the corporate world?" "Not immediately." The doctor was quite insistent about a 2-week recovery period at home. He said this with a slight smile, as if the concept of rest was a foreign language he was attempting to learn. I went through the motions of my final check, recording his vitals one last time. We chatted about his discharge instructions, but there was an undercurrent of finality that made each word feel weighted. As I finished, he cleared his throat. "Alex, I'd like to make you a proposal." My guard immediately went up. Despite our connection, I was acutely aware of the power imbalance between us. "Mr. Kessler." "Robert," he corrected automatically. "Robert," I acknowledged. "Whatever you're about to propose, remember I'm still your nurse, and there are ethical—" He held up a hand. "Nothing inappropriate, I promise." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit." I sat cautiously, clipboard still in hand like a shield. "You've shared with me your financial struggles," he began. "The loans, the night shifts, the toll it's taking on your education and health." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like to help." My cheeks flushed. "I wasn't telling you those things to—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "You were being human with another human. But I have resources that could remove those obstacles for you." My mind raced through possibilities, each more uncomfortable than the last. "I can't accept money from a patient," I said firmly. "Not as a patient," he clarified. "As a mentor." He leaned forward slightly. "Alex, you're exceptionally bright and compassionate, qualities that make an outstanding nurse but also transferable to many fields. I'd like to establish a scholarship through my foundation that would cover the remainder of your education and living expenses." I stared at him, speechless. "No strings attached," he continued. "You wouldn't owe me anything. Consider it an investment in potential." "Why?" I finally managed. "Why me?" He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window. "Because you stayed that night," he said simply. "Because you saw me as a person, not a position or a resource." He looked back at me. "And selfishly, because helping you gives purpose to wealth that has become increasingly meaningless to me." My mind whirled with conflicts, ethical considerations, pride, the sheer magnitude of what he was offering. "I don't know if I can accept something like that." "You don't have to decide now," he said, "but consider this. Your goal is to help others through nursing. If financial struggle prevents you from reaching your full potential in that field, aren't you limiting the good you can do?" He had a point, but something still felt unresolved. "What would you want in return?" "Really?" His answer surprised me. "Conversation," he said. "Not as a nurse and patient, but as two people navigating different stages of life. I've spent decades surrounded by people who want something from me. You're the first person in years who simply offered presence. I left his room that night with his business card and a head spinning with possibilities. The ethical nurse in me was wary of crossing boundaries. The struggling student saw a lifeline. But the human in me recognized something equally valuable to both of us. An authentic connection in a world where those had become increasingly rare for both a CEO and a night shift nurse. Over the next few days, I consulted my nursing advisor and the hospital ethics board. To my surprise, they didn't immediately reject the idea. With proper documentation and transparency, such mentorship arrangements weren't unprecedented. As long as our patient-caregiver relationship had formally ended, the decision was ultimately mine. A week later, I met Robert at his office, a stark contrast to the hospital room where we'd met. As we finalized the details of what would become the Kessler Healthcare Scholarship, I realized this wasn't just financial assistance. It was the beginning of a relationship that would challenge both of us to see beyond our defined roles and reconnect with parts of ourselves we'd forgotten existed. The next 6 months unfolded in ways I never could have imagined that night I first walked into room 302. With Robert's scholarship covering my expenses, I was able to quit my night shifts and focus fully on my education. My grades improved dramatically, and for the first time since starting nursing school, I wasn't perpetually exhausted. But the transformation went far beyond academics. True to his word, Robert didn't disappear after writing a check. We established a rhythm of meeting for coffee every other week, where our conversations continued to deepen. These weren't mentorship sessions in the traditional sense. Robert never told me what to do or how to think. Instead, we exchanged perspectives that challenged us both. "How's the patient in 415 doing?" he asked one afternoon, referencing a case I'd mentioned the week before. An elderly man recovering from a stroke with no family support. "Better," I replied, surprised he'd remembered the room number. "I've been spending extra time with him since he doesn't get visitors." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "You know, before I met you, I never considered what happens to people in hospitals beyond the medical treatment. The human element was invisible to me." This was the pattern of our relationship, seemingly small observations that revealed profound shifts in thinking. As I learned about finance, business strategy, and long-term planning from him, he seemed to be relearning something he'd lost along the way: the value of human connection. The changes in Robert were subtle at first. He started taking Fridays off, something his assistant told me had never happened in 15 years. He reconnected with his son, awkwardly at first, meeting for brief lunches that gradually extended into longer conversations. He mentioned joining a board not for business connections, but because he believed in their mission to expand healthcare access. "My doctors tell me my blood pressure is the lowest it's been in a decade," he shared one day, a hint of wonder in his voice. "Apparently, working 80 hours a week isn't actually a requirement for survival." I laughed. "Revolutionary concept, I know. I built an empire thinking it would protect me," he admitted. "Never realized it had become a prison." The most significant change came 4 months after his discharge. He invited me to the opening of a new wing at Memorial Hospital, the Kessler Center for Family Support, a space dedicated to providing resources and comfort for the families of long-term patients. As we toured the facility with its comfortable sleeping accommodations, kitchen, and child-friendly spaces, I recognized elements from conversations we'd had about improving the hospital experience. "You actually listened to my rambling," I said, amazed to see ideas I'd casually mentioned transformed into reality. "You showed me what was missing," he replied simply. "I just had the resources to address it." My own transformation was equally profound. With financial pressure lifted, I discovered parts of myself beyond survival mode. I excelled in my clinical rotations, developed a research interest in improving patient experience, and even found time to volunteer at a community clinic. The constant knot of anxiety I'd carried for years gradually loosened. More importantly, I gained confidence, not just in nursing skills, but in my worth and voice. Having someone like Robert value my perspective changed how I saw myself. I became more assertive in patient advocacy, more innovative in problem solving, and more balanced in how I approached my career and personal life. "You look different," a classmate observed one day. "Less haunted." She was right. I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving, bringing my whole self to both my studies and my patients. And in watching Robert's journey toward rebalancing his life priorities, I learned perhaps the most valuable lesson. Success means nothing without well-being and connection. What began as a chance encounter between a sleep-deprived student and a lonely CEO had transformed into a relationship that reshaped both our definitions of what matters most. In helping each other see beyond our limited perspectives, we each found something we didn't know we were missing. He discovered purpose beyond profit, and I found confidence beyond struggle. It's been 3 years since that fateful night shift at Memorial Hospital. I'm now working as a registered nurse in the oncology department, a challenging role that tests both my clinical skills and emotional resilience daily. The scholarship Robert provided helped me graduate at the top of my class, debt-free and with opportunities I never thought possible. But the true value of our unlikely friendship wasn't measured in dollars or academic achievements. It was in the profound way it changed how we both moved through the world. Looking back, I realized we each had exactly what the other person needed. I offered Robert genuine human connection without agenda, and he gave me not just financial support, but a belief in my potential that I hadn't fully recognized myself. Robert's transformation has been remarkable to witness. The workaholic CEO who once lived on his laptop at 2 a.m. now strictly maintains what he calls human hours. His relationship with his son has steadily healed, and last month he attended his first granddaughter's birth, something the old Robert would have delegated to a gift basket in a quick phone call. The company still thrives, but he's assembled a leadership team that allows him to step back and focus on the philanthropic foundation that's become his passion. The irony, he told me recently over our now monthly coffee meetings, is that in slowing down, I've become more effective. Turns out exhaustion isn't actually a business strategy. The Kessler Healthcare Scholarship has expanded beyond just me. It now supports 5 nursing students each year, prioritizing those working night shifts to make ends meet. Robert interviews each candidate personally, something he says keeps him connected to what matters. He's become a regular visitor at Memorial, not as a patient, but as a volunteer, sitting with those who have no visitors, the lonely souls in rooms like his once was. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the most significant changes in our lives come from the most unexpected encounters. Every time I enter a patient's room, I remember how a simple human connection can transcend professional boundaries and remind us of our shared humanity. I pay special attention to the quiet patients, the ones without flowers or cards, knowing that loneliness can exist even in rooms filled with the most expensive medical equipment. Sometimes the most life-changing moments happen during our darkest hours. That night shift didn't just provide financial relief through an unexpected scholarship. It taught me that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in meaningful connections. It showed me that everyone, regardless of their status or position, needs to be seen as a person first. If this story resonated with you, hit like and subscribe to hear more real-life experiences that remind us we're all connected in ways we never expect. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their current struggle might be leading to something beautiful. Sometimes the person in front of you, whether a patient in room 302 or a tired student working the night shift, might be exactly the one who changes your life forever.